This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Neumann. I'm the National Director of the United Steelworkers. Joining me today is the Honourable Peter MacKay, Canadian Minister of Defence. Mr. MacKay represents the riding of Central Nova Scotia, where 20 years ago tomorrow the Westray mine exploded, killing 26 miners. 11 of those bodies were never recovered. Also with me is NDP member of the official opposition, Robert Chisholm, who's an MP from Nova Scotia. And also with Mr. MacKay and Mr. Chisholm is also Mr. Vern Theriault. Mr. Theriault is a Westray survivor, a member of 1992 rescue and recovery team that worked so valiantly in the days following this massive explosion. He's a Medal of Bravery recipient for the courage he showed at the time. We're also here today to announce the events around the 20th anniversary of Westray and to address the next steps in this never-ending struggle to protect worker safety. As well, the United Steelworkers ask for this opportunity to draw the attention to the unanimous commitment made by the House of Commons 8 years ago to pass the Westray Bill. Changes to the criminal code with respect to corporate accountability for health and safety. Tomorrow's commemoration will take place at and around the Westray Memorial in Stellarton, Nova Scotia, where many former employees and families still live. There will be an early morning vigil followed by a day of activities, and at 7 p.m. in the evening, service at the Memorial Park. The agenda for those events is available here today. Before I open up any of the questions you may have, I'm going to ask the Minister MacKay to speak. Before that, we also got another guest. We have the Minister of Labour, Lisa Rae, that's going to be with us, who's also going to say a few words. So I would now want to call on Peter MacKay to say a few words. His support, I must say, was instrumental in making the Westray amendments to the Criminal Code law, and many of his constituents in Central Nova Scotia are families of those who have died. First decade following the Westray disaster, the United Steelworkers led the campaign to amend the Criminal Code to make corporations, their directors, executive accountable for willfully putting workers' lives at risk. The Westray Bill passed into law in 2004, and in the 8 years since, few prosecutions have moved forward with no serious convictions. With this Westray 20th anniversary, the United Steelworkers are launching a campaign to ensure the enforcement of the law. The campaign is directed to increase the education, training, and political will necessary in each of the provinces and territories to finally ensure that the legislation is used and prosecutions proceed. It is our belief that Westray amendments made the criminal code stronger. They were the right decisions by Parliament. If used by our law enforcement authorities, it can prevent future Westrays and bring those at fault to justice. Now, 20 years later, we must remind MPs of their important contribution to improving the law, and at the same time raise awareness and educate Attorney Generals of the provinces to enforce the Westray Act fully and completely. We will now open for questions to this conference.
A couple of questions. How many charges have there been under Bill C-45?
I think that maybe the Minister knows. I think there's a total of 6 charges, but there's never been a successful prosecution. Usually they may have been a plea bargain at some point where a fine may have been assessed.
So of all of those deaths, do you have any sense of how many charges there could have been if the Bill C-45 were used perhaps in the way that you would want?
Well, I personally think from the union's perspective, and I know that our union, the Steelworkers, works in many of these industries, and I can tell you that since the bill was passed, there's been 8,000 workplace deaths. I'm sure that not every one of those was a Westray situation. I think what we're looking at here is to making sure that that the law, that they put the full force of the law, the investigation, and the Attorney Generals. There has to be the political will, there has to be the education, and the will to basically move forward. And they have to send a very strong signal that this is just totally unacceptable. I can tell you that just within the last year, we've had 4 fatalities that are mining at Sudbury and Thompson, Manitoba, Witches Valley, which we're now waiting for the Ontario government to hopefully lay the criminal charges. We've done our investigation. We believe that there's enough evidence for criminal charges. We had the Weyerhaeuser situation in 2004 in British Columbia, where the investigators agreed that charges should be proceed under the Westray. The Crown prosecutor withdrew. We've also just had, as it's been in the news in the forest industry, we've had 2 back-to-back mine explosions. We've had 2 fatalities at Burns Lake. We just had another 2 fatalities in Prince George where the sawmills have blown up. We just had a fatality on the weekend. I can just tell you that I don't enjoy calling families that their loved ones ain't going to be coming home. That's just not the society that we care for. And to have 8,000 fatalities, sorry.
Mr. MacKay, when you brought this bill in, or you worked hard on it back then, is this what you had in mind? Years later now, we're just seeing these fatalities, and we're not seeing any convictions. 8,000 fatalities, as you mentioned. So what can be done about it? You sit around the cabinet table. This is not, I'm sure it's not what you had in mind.
Well, there was tremendous will on the part of all parties and people involved in bringing this legislation forward. It first came forward as private members' bills, and then it was later adopted by the government. And Ken is right. There's nothing more devastating than losing people in the community in a workplace environment that should be safe. And as Vern has described, people getting up and going to work in the morning should not face that trauma. And the intent here is not only to hold people responsible, criminally responsible, but to prevent and to raise the standard for corporations, for directors, for those who have primary responsibility for workplace safety. Having said that, it takes many people to ensure that this happens, including inspectors, including the safety courses, including all of the good things that the union and those involved in workplace safety have fought for, and including raising awareness and education about preventing these things from happening.
What about the political will? I mean, you're just talking about there needs to be, when you talk about inspection, safety, all of that, what's the problem with political will? I don't quite understand it.
Well, there was political will to make the law and make the changes in the criminal code to raise accountability. And I would suggest to you that it's now enforcement. It's now the direct interpretation of the law. This falls very much in terms of the final determination to prosecutors at various offices around the country and interpretation of evidence. I was working in the Crown Prosecutor's office in New Glasgow when this explosion happened, and they took all of the senior prosecutors and assigned them to the prosecution of this file. And sadly, this is not an area of the law where clearly we have not been able to achieve a successful prosecution as yet. Now, I know from having practiced law that there are lots of factors that determine the outcome of a case, most importantly the evidence and the way in which it's collected and presented to a court. So I spoke with Minister Nicholson about this, our Attorney General, our Justice Minister. He is very committed to working with the provinces, to providing assistance, guidance, support where it's needed, to see that we continue to call for the enforcement of the law. The law is there. It's in the criminal code. There are labor standards as well that Minister Raitt can speak to. So this attempt today is to raise more awareness, to call for enforcement, and to call for cooperation for greater workplace safety.
Just one further thing, and I'm pleased that Minister MacKay talks about the enforcement and the prosecutors. I think there's also a culture shift. If you look at 20 years ago, is that health and safety, people looked at it as a regulatory process. That's why we proceeded to change the criminal code to incorporate it. So I think there has to be that shift in regards to that. It's the same as when you have someone's murdered. I mean, you have to have that mindset that it's not a regulatory process. You have to investigate it to its fullest, and that's where I think the political will, the education to the prosecutors, and that's what's important. Any further questions?
No will. If this law has existed since 2004 and no one's been prosecuted, what is the point of even having the law?
Well, I can tell you from the steelworkers' perspective, we went to great lengths. We actually took over a case, the Weyerhaeuser case, where initially the investigators said to proceed with the charges. It went before the judge. The judge said there was enough evidence, but the Crown prosecutor decided to withdraw. And I think that that's the reason that why we're here today. That's why we're going to be in Pictou County tomorrow, to raise that awareness. I'm pleased that we've got the ministers here with us today, that we want to move forward because, as you say, you're right. What's the purpose of the law if it's not being enforced?